The double-bladed axe came down with a sound like thunder, and the oak log split perfectly down the center in a single stroke. Thomas Garrett stepped back, breathing hard, watching the two halves fall away clean. He had just split in 1 hour what normally took 3, and every mountain man within 50 miles would soon want to know how. But the tool in his hands, the design that would change frontier survival for 2 decades, had taken him 8 months of failure, injury, and obsessive experimentation to perfect. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The axe head buried itself 3 inches into the frozen cottonwood log and stuck fast. Marcus Webb yanked on the handle once, twice, then braced his boot against the log and pulled with both hands. The axe came free with a sharp crack, but Marcus stumbled backward, his right shoulder twisting awkwardly as he caught himself. He dropped the axe and clutched his shoulder, his face going white. Thomas Garrett was checking trap lines 100 yards away when he heard Marcus shout his name. By the time Thomas reached the wood-splitting area behind their cabin, Marcus was sitting on the ground, his right arm hanging limp, his face twisted in pain. The shoulder had dislocated. Thomas could see it immediately from the unnatural angle and the way Marcus cradled the arm against his chest. Thomas helped Marcus into the cabin and spent the next hour trying to relocate the shoulder, using techniques he had seen a trapper named Carson use 5 years earlier. When the joint finally popped back into place, both men were soaked in sweat despite the February cold. Over the next week, as Marcus rested and Thomas handled all the camp duties, it became clear the injury was not healing properly. Marcus could barely lift his arm above his waist. His trapping career, at least for this season and possibly forever, was finished. Thomas had partnered with Marcus for 3 winters. They were efficient together, working parallel trap lines and sharing the labor of camp maintenance. Now Thomas was alone with all the work. Checking traps, processing pelts, cooking, hauling water, and most time-consuming of all, splitting firewood. In the Montana Territory in February of 1841, staying warm was not optional. The cabin needed constant heat. Thomas found himself spending 4 to 5 hours every day just preparing fuel. He had never paid much attention to wood splitting before. It was simply work that needed doing. But now, doing it alone for hours every single day, Thomas began to notice things. He noticed how often the axe stuck in the wood instead of splitting through. He noticed how many swings it took to split a single log, usually 3 to 5 for oak, sometimes 7 or 8 if the grain was difficult. He noticed how his hands blistered despite calluses, how his back ached, how his shoulders burned with fatigue. Most of all, he noticed how much time it consumed, time he could not spend trapping. One evening in late February, after splitting wood for 4 hours and producing barely enough to last 2 days, Thomas sat by the fire examining his axe. It was well made, the head forged from good steel, the handle seasoned hickory, but it was just like every other axe, the same shape, the same weight, the same limitations. Thomas turned the axe over in his hands, studying the blade angle, the balance point, the way the handle attached to the head. Marcus watched from his bunk, his injured arm in a sling. Marcus asked what Thomas was thinking about. Thomas said he was wondering why axes had to be made this way, whether there might be a better design. Marcus told him he was wasting his time, that axes had been made the same way for hundreds of years. Thomas did not argue, but he also did not stop thinking about it. Thomas began his study in early March of 1842, when the worst of winter had passed but cold still dominated the Montana wilderness. He started by watching how wood actually split under the axe blade. He selected logs of different species, oak, pine, cottonwood, aspen, and split them slowly, paying attention to every detail. He noticed that wood did not break uniformly. It followed grain lines, natural weaknesses in the cellular structure. When the axe blade entered at the right angle along these grain lines, the log split cleanly. When the blade hit at the wrong angle or across the grain, it stuck or deflected. He began documenting patterns. Oak required more force but split predictably if you read the grain correctly. Pine split easily, but the blade often stuck in the resinous wood. Cottonwood was soft and required precision rather than power. Frozen logs behaved completely differently from thawed logs, requiring steeper blade angles and more forceful swings. Thomas spent hours examining split logs, studying the fracture patterns, trying to understand why some splits were clean and others ragged. Over the next month, Thomas visited 4 other trappers' camps within a day's travel. He watched how different men approached wood splitting. Most used brute force, swinging hard and repeatedly until the log gave way. A few used technique, studying each log before the first swing, choosing striking points carefully. Thomas noticed that skilled splitters still spent enormous amounts of time on the task. Even the best technique with a standard axe required multiple swings per log. The limitation was not the men, it was the tool. Back at his own cabin, Thomas began sketching modifications using charcoal on flat pieces of bark. He drew axes with longer handles for more leverage. He drew blades with different angles, some narrow and sharp, others wide and blunt. He drew variations in weight distribution, moving the center of mass closer to or farther from the blade. Marcus, recovering slowly, watched these efforts with skepticism. He told Thomas that if there was a better way to make an axe, someone would have discovered it centuries ago. Thomas replied that maybe no one had needed to discover it badly enough. Thomas's observations were leading him toward a realization that would change everything. The problem with standard axes was not any single feature. It was how the blade interacted with wood during the split. A traditional axe blade entered the wood and created a wedge force, pushing the wood apart. But once the blade was buried in the log, that wedge force stopped working efficiently. The blade became stuck, requiring additional swings to complete the split. What if, Thomas wondered, there was a way to keep the wedge force working throughout the entire split? What if the blade was not just a single wedge, but multiple wedges working in sequence? He did not yet know how to build such a tool, but he had identified the fundamental problem. The standard axe stopped working halfway through its job. Thomas needed to design one that finished what it started. Thomas's first modification came in late March of 1842. He took his standard axe to a blacksmith at a trading post 2 days right away and asked the man to reshape the blade to a narrower angle, 20 degrees instead of the typical 35. The blacksmith questioned the request, but agreed when Thomas paid in advance with beaver pelts. Thomas returned to his cabin confident he had solved the problem. A narrower blade should penetrate deeper with less resistance, requiring fewer swings to complete each split. The modified axe was worse. The narrow blade entered the wood easily but created almost no splitting force. It acted like a wedge driven into a crack that refused to widen. Thomas swung 5, 6, 7 times on logs that previously required 3 swings. The blade stuck so firmly that extraction became a separate struggle. After 2 days of testing, Thomas admitted the narrow angle was a complete failure. He tried the opposite approach. He returned to the blacksmith and requested a wider blade angle, 50 degrees, thinking more wedge force would split logs faster. The blacksmith told Thomas he was wasting good steel, but again accepted payment and did the work. The wide-angle blade bounced off hardwood like a hammer striking stone. It could not penetrate deep enough to initiate splits. Thomas felt like he was beating logs into submission rather than splitting them. This second failure cost him another week of work and more pelts. Thomas then experimented with handle length. He built a handle 4 feet long, thinking increased leverage would multiply his striking force. The first swing taught him why no one used 4-foot handles. The axe was impossibly awkward, the weight distribution completely wrong. He nearly lost control mid-swing and buried the blade in the ground inches from his boot. He cut the handle down to 18 inches, thinking shorter meant more control. The shortened handle eliminated leverage entirely. Each swing felt weak, ineffectual. He was back to square one. His most dangerous failure came in May. Thomas had commissioned a blade with an experimental curve, thinking it might guide splits along grain lines more effectively. During his third swing with this curved blade, the handle snapped at the head joint. The axe head flew past Thomas's face close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. It embedded itself in a log 15 feet away. Thomas stood frozen, realizing how close he had come to death. That night he examined the broken handle and understood his mistake. He had weakened the wood by overshaping the joint to accommodate the curved blade. Marcus told Thomas he should give up these experiments before he got himself killed. Thomas had burned through 5 axe modifications, spent a significant portion of their spring earnings on materials and blacksmith fees, and nearly died in the process. He had learned definitively what did not work. Narrow blades, wide blades, long handles, short handles, curved blades, all failures. But he had not yet discovered what would work. That revelation was still months away. In late April of 1842, Thomas made a supply run to Fort Benton, a trading post 3 days' ride northeast of his cabin. He needed powder, lead, salt, and flour. The fort was busy with spring activity, trappers selling winter furs, traders preparing goods for the season's commerce. Thomas sold his pelts and was loading supplies onto his pack horse when he heard rhythmic hammering from behind one of the storage buildings. He walked around the corner and found a timber crew preparing logs for a new warehouse construction. 4 men were working on a massive pine log, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. They were not using axes, they were using iron wedges driven in sequence. The first man would drive a wedge into one end of the log, creating an initial crack. The second man would drive another wedge 6 inches deeper into the same crack. The third and fourth men drove additional wedges further along, each one forcing the split wider and deeper. Thomas watched as the huge log split cleanly down its entire length in less than 5 minutes. The technique was not new. Wedges had been used for splitting since ancient times. But watching the men work in sequence, each wedge building on the work of the previous one, triggered something in Thomas's mind. The wedges did not work individually. They worked together, each one forcing the split wider until the wood's resistance collapsed completely. What if an axe could work the same way? Not one blade doing all the work, but multiple blades in sequence, each one continuing where the previous one stopped. Thomas stood watching the crew for 20 minutes, studying the angles of the wedges, the spacing between them, how each wedge was positioned to maximize the splitting force created by the wedge before it. The men noticed him staring and asked if he needed something. Thomas apologized for the distraction and returned to his supplies, but his mind was racing. He spent the 3-day ride back to his cabin thinking about nothing else. A standard axe was a single wedge. It created splitting force until it became buried in the wood, then that force stopped. But what if there was a second blade behind the first, positioned to continue forcing the split wider as the first blade penetrated? The first blade would create the initial fracture. The second blade, offset by a few inches, would widen that fracture before the wood could resist. 2 blades working in sequence, like the timber crew's wedges, but integrated into a single tool. Thomas reached his cabin on May 2nd and immediately began sketching. He drew an axe head with a primary blade and a secondary wedge blade positioned 2 inches behind it. The design looked strange, unbalanced, possibly unworkable. But the principle felt right. Marcus asked what Thomas was drawing. Thomas said he thought he finally understood what had been wrong with every previous attempt. He had been trying to perfect a single blade. What he needed was 2 blades working together. Thomas found a blacksmith named Heinrich Volker at a small trading post 30 miles south of his cabin. Volker was German, skilled, and willing to attempt unusual requests if paid properly. Thomas showed him the sketches of the double blade design. Volker studied the drawings, asked several questions about blade angles and offset positioning, then quoted a price of 6 prime beaver pelts. Thomas agreed immediately. The work would take 2 weeks. Thomas returned in mid-May to collect his first prototype. The double blade axe looked exactly as he had sketched it. A primary blade at 30 degrees, a secondary wedge blade at 45 degrees, offset by 2 inches behind the first. The total weight was 9 pounds, 2 pounds heavier than a standard axe. Thomas paid Volker and rode back to his cabin, eager to test it. The first swing nearly ended the entire experiment. The axe was terribly balanced. The secondary blade created unexpected weight distribution that made the tool want to twist in Thomas's hands mid-swing. He managed to hit the log, and the double blade did create an impressive split, but controlling the axe required enormous effort. After 20 swings, Thomas's forearms burned with fatigue from fighting the imbalanced weight. The design principle was correct. The execution was completely wrong. Thomas returned to Volker 3 days later with specific modifications. Reduce the overall weight to 7 pounds. Move the secondary blade 1 inch closer to the primary blade. Adjust the primary blade angle to 35 degrees. Volker made the changes, charging 2 more pelts. The second prototype was better, but still not right. The blades were now too close together, interfering with each other's splitting action. Thomas went back again. Over the next 6 weeks, Thomas made 5 trips to Volker's forge. Each prototype revealed new problems. The third version had correct blade spacing, but the handle attached at the wrong angle, making accurate strikes nearly impossible. The fourth version had a handle that was too thin and cracked after 50 swings. The fifth version had blades positioned correctly but weighed 8 pounds, too heavy for sustained use. Thomas was spending more time traveling to the forge than testing designs. His supply of beaver pelts was dwindling rapidly. The learning process was brutal. Thomas split hundreds of test logs, documenting every result. He measured blade angles with strings and weights, ensuring each prototype matched his specifications exactly. He discovered that blade position mattered down to fractions of an inch. Too close together, and the blades interfered with each other. Too far apart, and the secondary blade did not engage before the wood resisted the split. He learned that handle length affected not just leverage, but also striking accuracy. A 32-inch handle allowed proper arc and control. 30 inches was too short, 34 inches too long. His hands developed permanent calluses on top of existing calluses. His right shoulder ached constantly from the repetitive testing. Marcus told Thomas he had become obsessed, that he was wasting an entire season chasing an impossible improvement. Thomas did not disagree about the obsession, but he knew he was close to something that worked. On July 9, 1842, Thomas collected what he believed would be his final prototype from Volker's forge. The specifications were precise after months of refinement. Primary blade at 35 degrees, secondary wedge blade at 50 degrees. Offset distance of 2 1/4 inches, total weight 7 pounds exactly, handle length 32 inches, made from seasoned hickory with grain running straight through the wood. The balance point was 4 inches below the axe head, allowing natural rotation during the swing. Thomas returned to his cabin and selected 6 identical oak logs, each approximately 18 inches in diameter, with straight grain and no visible knots. He split 3 logs using his old standard axe, counting swings and timing the work. The first log required 4 swings and took roughly 2 minutes, including repositioning time. The second required 5 swings, 3 minutes. The third required 4 swings, 2 minutes. Total time for 3 logs was 7 minutes, 13 swings total. He picked up the double blade axe and approached the remaining 3 oak logs. The first swing came down centered on the log's crown. The primary blade bit deep, creating the initial split. A fraction of a second later, the secondary wedge blade engaged, forcing the crack wider with brutal efficiency. The log split completely in one stroke with a sound like a rifle shot. Thomas stood staring at the 2 clean halves. He had just done in one swing what normally required 4. The second log split identically. 1 swing, clean separation. The third log had more difficult grain, a slight twist that would normally cause binding. The double blade cut through it in a single stroke. Thomas had split 3 logs in 90 seconds with 3 swings total. The improvement was not marginal, it was revolutionary. He spent the rest of the day testing different wood types. Pine split so cleanly and quickly that Thomas had to slow down to avoid exhausting himself. Cottonwood, which often required 6 or 7 swings with a standard axe, split in 2 swings with the double blade. Even frozen logs left over from winter stores split with remarkable ease. The secondary wedge blade prevented the binding that made frozen wood so difficult with traditional axes. Thomas timed himself splitting a full cord of mixed hardwood. 97 minutes from start to finish. He had split identical quantities earlier that spring using his standard axe. Those sessions had taken between 3 and 4 hours. The double blade design had cut his wood splitting time by more than half. Marcus came outside to see what the noise was about and found Thomas standing amid an enormous pile of split wood, breathing hard, holding the double blade axe. Marcus asked how long Thomas had been working. Thomas said about an hour and a half. Marcus looked at the woodpile, easily 2 weeks of fuel, and said that was impossible. Thomas handed him the axe and told him to try it himself. Marcus swung once at a cottonwood log. It split cleanly. Marcus swung again at an oak log, same result. Marcus lowered the axe slowly and said Thomas had actually done it. He had built something that changed everything. The first person to see Thomas's innovation was a trapper named Robert Kinney, who stopped at the cabin in mid-August of 1842. Kinney was traveling south toward Fort Hall and needed to camp for the night. Thomas offered hospitality, as was customary among mountain men. Kinney arrived in the afternoon and immediately noticed the massive woodpile stacked behind the cabin. He commented that Thomas must have spent weeks preparing winter fuel so early in the season. Thomas said he had split most of it in the past 4 days. Kinney laughed, thinking Thomas was joking. Thomas did not laugh back. He picked up the double-blade axe and told Kinney to select any log from the pile. Kinney chose a thick oak log with visible knots, the kind that would typically require sustained effort. Thomas split it with one swing. Kinney stood silent for a moment, then asked to examine the axe. Thomas explained the design while Kinney studied the double-blade configuration. The primary blade creates the initial split. The secondary wedge blade, offset behind it, forces the crack wider before the wood can resist. 2 blades working in sequence like timber wedges, but integrated into a single tool. Kinney asked if he could try it. Thomas handed over the axe. Kinney split 3 logs in 3 swings and asked where Thomas had gotten it made. Thomas told him about Volker's forge and explained the blade angles and specifications exactly. Kinney said every trapper in the territory would want one of these. Thomas said he hoped so, because winter killed men who ran out of firewood. Kinney left the next morning but spread word of what he had seen. Within 2 weeks, 3 more trappers visited Thomas's cabin specifically to see the double-blade axe. Thomas demonstrated it for each visitor and answered questions about the design freely. He was not trying to keep secrets or profit from the innovation. He simply wanted others to survive more efficiently. One visitor, a former blacksmith named Samuel Cross, asked if Thomas would mind if Cross made copies. Thomas said he would mind if Cross did not make copies because men needed these tools. By October of 1842, 7 double-blade axes existed in the northern Montana Territory. Samuel Cross had forged 4 copies at his small wilderness forge, charging only for materials and basic labor. Each owner reported the same dramatic results. Wood splitting time cut by half or more. Fewer swings meant less fatigue and lower injury risk. Men who had dreaded the daily wood-splitting routine now completed it quickly and moved on to more productive work. The trappers began calling them Garrett axes, after Thomas's surname, though Thomas never encouraged the name. Others called them double splits or split axes. The terminology varied, but the design specifications remained consistent. 35-degree primary blade, 50-degree secondary wedge, 2 1/4 inch offset, 7-pound total weight, 32-inch handle. Those numbers had been bought with months of failure and testing. Now they were spreading freely through the mountain community, carried by men who understood that good tools meant survival. Through the winter of 1842 and into the spring of 1843, the double-blade design evolved as different men adapted it to their specific needs. Samuel Cross, the blacksmith who had forged the first copies, experimented with a 3rd small wedge positioned between the primary and secondary blades. His theory was that 3 blades would split wood even faster than 2. The result was mixed. The triple blade design worked exceptionally well on softwoods like pine and cottonwood, splitting them almost explosively. But on hardwoods, the middle wedge created interference, actually reducing efficiency below the original 2-blade configuration. Cross abandoned the triple blade for general use, but kept one for specialized work with softwoods. A trapper named William Dawson faced a different problem. He worked trap lines in high-altitude areas where temperatures dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. At those temperatures, wood became brittle and split differently than thawed logs. Dawson took his double-blade axe to a blacksmith at Fort Benton and requested steeper blade angles, 60 degrees on the secondary wedge instead of 50. The modification worked perfectly for frozen wood, creating clean splits with minimal binding. Dawson's winter-specific variant became popular among trappers working the coldest regions. Thomas himself continued refining his original design. In January of 1843, he added a slight curve to the handle, bending it perhaps 3 degrees along its length. The curve improved shock absorption, reducing the jarring impact transmitted to his hands and shoulders with each swing. The modification was subtle but made sustained splitting sessions noticeably more comfortable. He also experimented with handle grip wrapping, using leather strips to create a textured surface that prevented slipping during sweaty work. Other innovations emerged from practical experience. A trapper discovered that coating the blades with rendered bear fat reduced friction and prevented pitch from sticky woods like pine from building up on the steel. Another found that slightly rounding the corners where the secondary wedge met the primary blade eliminated a weak point where cracks sometimes developed in the metal. These small improvements were shared freely at trading posts and rendezvous gatherings. The double blade design was becoming more refined through collective experimentation. By the spring of 1843, the basic principles were well established, but the specific implementations varied. A trapper could request a Garrett axe from any competent blacksmith and receive a functional double-blade tool, but the exact angles and dimensions might differ slightly based on the blacksmith's interpretation and the customer's intended use. What remained constant was the core innovation: two blades working in sequence to complete splits that single-blade axes struggled with. The practical impact was measurable. Trappers reported spending 1 to 2 hours daily on wood splitting instead of 4 to 5. That time savings translated directly to increased trapping productivity or simply more rest, both valuable commodities in the demanding mountain lifestyle. Injury rates from splitting accidents decreased noticeably. Fewer swings meant fewer opportunities for glancing blows, handle breaks, or exhaustion-related mistakes. The double-blade axe had solved a problem that most men had accepted as unsolvable, and the solution was spreading across the entire northern Rocky Mountain region. Between 1843 and 1850, the double-blade axe became standard equipment among northern Rocky Mountain trappers and early settlers. Blacksmiths at major trading posts like Fort Benton, Fort Hall, and Fort Bridger kept the specifications on hand and forged them on request. The design spread beyond Montana into Wyoming Territory, Idaho Territory, and north into British Canada. Trappers traveling the circuit carried the design with them, demonstrating it at rendezvous gatherings where hundreds of mountain men congregated each summer to sell furs and resupply. Homesteaders arriving in the region during the late 1840s quickly adopted the tool. Clearing land for farms required splitting enormous quantities of wood for cabins, fences, and fuel. The double-blade design cut that labor dramatically. A family could clear and build in one season what previously required 2. Letters and journals from the period reference split axes or double-blade axes as essential tools, ranked alongside rifles and plows in importance. One settler's account from 1848 described splitting enough fence rails in a single week to enclose 4 acres, work that would have taken a month with traditional tools. Logging operations experimented with scaled-up versions for industrial timber work. Several camps commissioned massive double-blade axes weighing 15 to 20 pounds, thinking they could revolutionize log processing. The experiments failed. The double-blade design worked brilliantly for individual survival and homesteading, but could not compete with crosscut saws for high-volume timber production. The sweet spot remained one man, one axe, one winter's worth of firewood, or one season's worth of building materials. For that specific application, nothing was more efficient. The design's reputation spread through practical demonstration rather than formal promotion. A settler would visit a neighbor and notice how quickly the neighbor split wood. Questions would lead to examination of the tool. Specifications would be copied or commissioned from the nearest blacksmith. By 1848, it was difficult to find a homestead or trapping camp in the northern Rockies that did not have at least one double-blade axe. The tool had become ubiquitous through pure utility. Thomas continued trapping until 1848, when declining beaver populations and collapsed fur prices made the profession unsustainable. The silk hat industry in eastern markets had destroyed demand for beaver felt. Trappers across the West were abandoning the mountains, seeking new opportunities in farming, prospecting, or moving to Oregon and California. Thomas sold his remaining trapping equipment, said goodbye to Marcus, who had recovered enough to work as a ranch hand in Wyoming, and joined a wagon train heading west. He carried one possession from his trapping years, his original double-blade axe, the 7th prototype that had finally worked. The tool had split thousands of logs over 6 years of constant use. The handles had been replaced twice, but the double blade head remained sharp and functional. Thomas used it to split wood for cooking fires during the 2-month journey to Oregon Territory. Other travelers on the wagon train noticed the unusual axe and asked about it. Thomas explained the design as he had explained it dozens of times before, freely sharing the specifications that had changed his life and the lives of countless others across the frontier. Thomas Garrett settled on 80 acres in the Willamette Valley in Oregon Territory in the autumn of 1848. He built a cabin using his double-blade axe to split every board and timber. He cleared fields, planted crops, and gradually transformed from mountain man to farmer. In 1850, he married a widow named Catherine, who had lost her husband during the wagon train journey west. They had 2 daughters over the next 4 years. Thomas's life became ordinary, domestic, far removed from the wilderness that had nearly killed him and the innovation that had saved him. The double-blade axe hung in his barn alongside other tools. His daughters grew up watching their father split firewood with effortless efficiency, but never understood that the axe was unusual. To them, it was simply the tool their father used. Thomas rarely spoke about his trapping years. The past was the past. He focused on crops, livestock, and providing for his family. Meanwhile, across the frontier, the tool that bore his name was slowly becoming obsolete. The 1850s brought rapid industrialization to the American West. Sawmills powered by water and later steam could process logs far faster than any hand tool. Communities grew large enough that firewood became a commercial product rather than something each family prepared individually. Young men growing up in established towns never learned to split wood by hand because they simply purchased it, cut, and delivered. By the 1860s, few blacksmiths still forged double-blade axes. The demand had evaporated as frontier conditions gave way to settlement and infrastructure. The tool had been perfect for a specific moment in history when individuals lived isolated in the wilderness and survival depended on personal efficiency. That moment was passing. The double-blade design, so revolutionary 2 decades earlier, became a curiosity mentioned occasionally by old trappers telling stories that younger generations found difficult to believe. Thomas Garrett died on March 14, 1873, at age 64. A stroke took him quickly while he worked in his barn. His obituary in the Oregon City newspaper noted that he had been a trapper in the Rocky Mountains during the 1840s before settling in the Willamette Valley. It mentioned his wife, daughters, and grandchildren. It said nothing about an axe that had changed frontier survival for thousands of people across 2 decades and hundreds of thousands of square miles. His double-blade axe passed to his oldest daughter, who kept it for sentimental reasons but never used it. When she died in 1903, the axe ended up in a barn belonging to her son, who did not know what made it special. It hung on a wall alongside other old tools, its purpose and history forgotten. Similar axes gathered dust in barns, sheds, and attics across the Mountain West. Their owners, if they thought about them at all, assumed they were crude frontier blacksmith experiments, interesting but obsolete. The innovation that had saved countless hours of labor and enabled survival in one of Earth's harshest environments became invisible. Thomas Garrett's obsessive solution to an impossible problem had worked perfectly, spread organically, and then vanished from memory as completely as if it had never existed. Progress had made his genius unnecessary, and history forgot to write down what he had achieved before it disappeared.